So Brian's back with me to continue our conversation about how to navigate struggles with pornography. And as promised, we agreed to talk more about the role of religion in how some of those messages might contribute to somebody's struggle with pornography, but also how that same faith and principles can help somebody overcome struggles with pornography. So I hope you enjoy this chat, and this might be the first of many conversations we have about the intersection between religion and unwanted pornography viewing concerns. If you're like me, you know your mind can be your best or your worst friend. Our mind is an amazing tool that can do incredible things, but our mind can also create problems out of nowhere. Sometimes our mind keeps recommending the same solutions to problems even when they aren't working. I see this pattern play out as individuals try to overcome their anxiety, depression, or even struggles with pornography, using approaches that make sense but aren't very helpful. This podcast will show you how real researchers and clinicians are changing the way we approach mental health and reveal helpful research-supported principles designed to help real people with real problems. My name is Dr. Cameron Staley, and welcome to the Life After Series Radio. So we're back. Brian's back for some more. So I'm curious, do you ever have any thoughts after we do a podcast, things we weren't able to talk about or other connections you make?
Yeah, it's so funny, especially with last week being all about perfectionism and having listened to it again and hearing and having time to ponder that and think, oh wow, that really is me. I do, a lot of those concepts resonate with me and I identify with a lot of those struggles. So even with these podcasts, we'll record them, we'll talk. And I've had to be very conscious about saying, okay, I said what I needed to say, and there's probably lots more that can be said, but it's funny how naturally my mind kind of goes, oh, I could have said this and this and this. And I've had these thoughts since. And some of that is good because I think you can get a furthered amount of information for yourself as you think about these things. But it's a little dangerous if you say, oh, I should have said it this way and it would have been so much better, when you can't go back and change it. I mean, it's there and that's great. And now you just have room to grow and think. And so I have had a lot of thoughts about that. And specifically that last episode, I think I just got a lot of positive feedback about it resonating with a lot of people. And I think there's a common perfectionist mentality around some of these things. And one thing that stood out to me specifically was how perfectionism has played a part in the journey of learning how to struggle with and overcome pornography as a concern. And so watching my mentality kind of change as I took certain steps. And so growing up, it was all black and white, making the promises of, oh, I'm never going to look at porn again. And I remember actually driving to the top of a mountain with my iPad that I used to look up sexual imagery, and I threw it off the cliff.
Wow.
Because that was my last day, right? And I think I made it, 2 days, and then I was back in it, and I was like, oh, what a waste of an iPad, right?
Oh, no.
But looking at that and then fast forwarding through the years and making the decision to go to the church's addiction recovery program. And now all of a sudden it's a little more okay to tell people about it, and starting to understand a little bit of there's other people that struggle with this. And then that's helping it become a little more okay. And then in acceptance and commitment therapy and life after pornography and all the modules. And now it's really okay. And it's normal. And you can talk about it and you can connect with people and you can love yourself. And I think all that has brought down the intensity of the struggle in terms of before, when I'd have, call it an urge or a sexual impulse or a thought would enter my mind, all the other notions would come in at the same time of, oh, shame, like you're not even allowed to feel this way, you're not allowed to think that
Whoa.
way. And you've said this before in some of your videos, that that just shoots up the intensity of that emotion. And then you're looking at like a volcano erupting, this massive devastating event where it's hard to control that. But as I've learned to talk about it and minimize that intensity through mindfulness, now all of a sudden it's controlling a fire.
Mm.
It's containable, and sometimes it might get a little high or get a little hot, but I know how to take a step back, observe that, and say, okay, maybe we put too much wood on the fire. Maybe the wind just blew up and it was totally natural, but that's okay. And so that was just one really cool thought. Sorry, that was my soapbox already, starting off early. But it's cool to have thoughts like that come from these conversations. And I
Wow.
hope that people can have that as well in their conversations and get deeper and understand more and have that kind of self-actualization, the enlightenment of learning those things and understanding them and then implementing them. It's awesome. It's one of the best parts of doing this.
Wow. That's beautiful. I just like to listen to you talk, and that imagery of the volcano really speaks to me because I think about like, oh, be mindful. Like, how mindful can you be when there's like lava flows around your feet and
Right?
things are erupting and it's like it's too hot. I am out of here. And it actually takes some time thinking through all the messages that we've had and all the shame we've felt. And I think as we're able to work through that, and I think we work through it, just like you said, having conversations, it turns down the heat where it's like, yeah, there's a fire. I can actually sit with that a little bit more effectively now and understand the factors, the wind, the extra logs, and make some decisions now. It's a lot more manageable now. But when it's volcano level, it's really difficult to manage, if not impossible.
Exactly. Um, and just a few thoughts on while you were talking, having a fire is a good thing. Like it's warmth. It's a positive. Like you're surviving in life. And I mean, 500 years ago, if you didn't have a fire, you froze. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of how it works. And so getting rid of the idea that, oh, the fire is bad, you're not allowed to have the heat turn up, right? And you have to control that. And when you do try to control that to where there's no fire, that's when the volcano comes in. And then you're trying to stop Mount St. Helens going off, and it's just bad news.
You got it. And I think that's perfectionism is it's all or
Right.
none. There's no gray area. And like you said, it's like, yeah, the volcano's probably not ideal, but no fire, you're going to freeze. Like we need a fire that's manageable. Put a little ring around it and get some marshmallows and bring some friends. Like it's okay. But manage is the key thing. A forest fire is not manageable,
Right.
but a campfire is quite nice, quite pleasant, quite connecting. So yeah, I love that idea. And the other thing that, well, there's a couple things that stand out, is what you just described is a progression and a process. Not I threw my iPad off the cliff, I'm done.
I
And
wish.
yeah, like, oh, that would be a lot simpler. I would prefer that.
Right.
Oh, that was a lot quicker. Just throw away your device. We're good to go. But you described it. This actually took a lot of experiences and they built upon each other and you learned things. And the volcano turned into a fire over lots of years and conversations and work and connections and vulnerability. There wasn't a volcano switch to fire switch.
Right.
It was a progression for you.
And I know I say that I wish it was the simpler iPad off the cliff method, but like we talked about last time, I'm genuinely grateful for that progression. And I know I wasn't in the moment.
Yep.
Um, especially early on, because you just can't help but think, oh, this needs to be done. And you make those promises thinking that it will be done,
Yep.
or believing that you're thinking it will be done. But if you can get to that point where you can, even if you and still struggling with it, even if you say, okay, like this process is going to teach me so much, and it's going to turn this weakness into a strength, or what was perceived as a weakness into a strength, and you're going to be able to manage that, and that's beautiful, and that leads to connection, and that's going to benefit you so much on the back end. And that's the intent of this, is it can actually be a positive. And that mental switch that was a big milestone for me. And you're right, it wasn't just a flip, it was a process. But getting to where I can be grateful for it and understanding that it's taught me a lot of valuable lessons has been a very frustratingly powerful concept.
Yeah, and what you just described there is a transformation within yourself. And often we're so focused on this behavior has to go away. I can't look at sexual images on this iPad. That's how I'll know I'll be good to go. And what you just articulated there is an internal transformation process.
That sounds like a really fancy term, but I'm not sure.
And maybe I'll highlight in simpler terms the thing that you said that stood out the most, that actually warms my heart the very most, is you said, I can love myself. And that stands out to me so much because as I work with folks with mental health issues or compulsive sexual behaviors, they become their worst enemy. They hate their thoughts and emotions and urges and hate themselves. And for me, that transformation is complete, where my work as a therapist is done and I'm obsolete, which is my goal, is when they can say, I actually care about myself and I'm kind to myself. And you know what? I love myself. And for me, it's like, those are the sweetest words. So to hear you say that, if everything you said, I'm like, oh, I love it. But that's the most important part.
Funny thing is, I don't even remember saying that. So that must have been totally subconscious.
You threw it out there, but I caught it. Because that is the gem. That is the transformation.
Yeah, and it's certainly hard to get there. But I think having the contrast of knowing what it's like not to love myself, to now, it's polar opposite, black and white. So
That's
I'm
awesome.
glad. I'm glad.
It's incredible. So today we were planning on kind of taking a little dive into religion, which for me is, I actually really enjoy talking about religion and sexuality. I'm getting more comfortable talking about politics, but honestly, I don't love politics. But I need to get more comfortable because politics is important and this impacts real people. And I'm recognizing my own privilege as a white male where I haven't really needed to get into politics. And so I'm trying to better understand those implications. But religion is one of those things where it's like, oh, we don't want to talk about that. It's, you know, it's really personal and sacred. And yet I think we do need to talk about it. It's really rare that I have a conversation around sexuality where I don't also have a conversation about religion. Those are typically in the
Interesting.
same conversation.
Is that, I mean, I'd imagine that's pretty organic and just the nature of how it comes up. But
Yeah.
that's interesting that it happens that way.
Yeah. And I think sexuality and religion, they're co-creating or co-informing one another. And so they're kind of developing in tandem and influencing each other. And a lot of our beliefs around sexuality and development come from religious influences, but also a lot of our religious beliefs are around creation and sexuality. And they are kind of co-occurring, and yet we often think about these in different realms and they're in competition. And so I enjoy talking about them often in the safety of a counseling room. For me, when I do a chat over a podcast, I'm like, oh, I need to be more careful. Like, this is still religion, but it's like, we should be able to talk about this too. But I find myself being a little bit more hesitant.
I certainly noticed that emotion too of, oh, religion naturally is very, it can get very intense because of the vast amount of opinions or beliefs, and you just feel like you have to dance around the ice, right?
Yep.
But no, I agree with you. I think you got to talk about it. I mean, it's important, it's deep, and that's vulnerability, is being willing to talk about these things.
Yep. So Brian and I, we brought our ice skates tonight, and we're gonna get on the
Ooh.
ice. And I think,
Fall a few times. Yeah,
oh
I'm
yeah,
here
we're
for
gonna do it.
it.
We're gonna do it. But I think just to be really clear, I guess I want to tell people where I'm coming from, and you can share where you're coming from. But I've been a lifelong Christian. That's always been kind of the core of my belief. And I really enjoy talking about different religions in general. I started an interfaith and even non-faith student organization at my university because there are a lot of folks that didn't identify with the faith that also wanted to participate in those conversations. And so I also want to include people of a non-faith. Those are some of my favorite people. So I enjoy the complexities of religion. And as I've gotten to know other people's kind of experiences around their religious journey, it's actually helped me feel more comfortable talking about my own Christian faith. That is something that really is a central part of me. And so I'd say in my professional work, I don't identify as a Christian counselor. I'm more of a counselor who's also a Christian. And for me, I think those are different things. And so when people need to or want to talk about their faith, I'm happy to go there and talk about that in a counseling context. But if that's not relevant for somebody, I don't bring it up. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to fit. So I like the flexibility there. But my beliefs around being a Christian has shaped me in many ways about how I view progression and learning and forgiveness, and really trying to spend my time and energy with those that are struggling. For me, I try to emulate Jesus Christ the best that I can. And to me, his example was reach out to those that are struggling, not those that have it all figured out and those that seem to have it all put together. He spent his time with those that were marginalized, that didn't have a voice, that were discriminated and oppressed. And for me, that is often what it feels like my work is as a psychologist, is I get this wonderful privilege to spend my day listening to people and their experiences and to hear their stories where often the outside world never hears their voice. It really is a remarkable experience. And for me, that is so consistent with my faith, is sitting with those that are not allowed to speak about a mental health struggle or about racism or sexism or abuse or struggling with pornography. For me, those all feel very similar. And then with that, I'm also a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I was a young man, half a lifetime ago, I went on a mission, 2-year mission for my church, and lived in St. Louis in Missouri. And I loved it. I absolutely loved meeting people of different faiths, and that was a tremendous experience. And I'm one of those that I actually enjoy reading scripture and enjoy talking about it, enjoy going to church. So I'm one of those that really enjoys this. It doesn't feel like something that I have to do or have to get done. So I definitely want to put that out there. That's kind of my background. That's the lens I see things through. So we're going to talk about some of these religious messages and things we hear that might contribute to struggles with pornography. But I also want people to know, as I talk about this, I want to do it in a very respectful, delicate way, because the faith part is really quite central to me. And yet, as we often don't investigate things at a deep level, sometimes our surface level understanding can trip us up. So I hope, at least from my side, as we talk about things, people will take that in that spirit that I'm here to try to understand this intersection of religion and sexuality and not attack or defame or belittle a belief, because a lot of these beliefs are ones that I hold that are quite dear to me. But because it's so dear, I've spent a lot of time inspecting it and understanding it and dissecting it and taking things apart and looking at it. And for me, that journey has enriched my faith. But it's definitely different now than it was when I was a child or even a missionary. I'd say my work as a psychologist has caused me to dissect my religious beliefs in a way I wouldn't have never imagined. And for me, they are much richer and more meaningful, but they're definitely different than I'd say it was before I worked with hundreds of people and hearing their stories. So it's definitely evolved. So sometimes I think I see things differently, definitely than I used to be, but maybe differently than some people in my church might view things. And I think that's okay.
Can I ask? I'm curious what you mean by the language around that, because your beliefs have evolved. Does that mean your beliefs about the fundamental beliefs have evolved, or your faith? I'm a little. I'm just curious.
That's a great question. That helps me maybe be more descriptive. I think the important parts of my faith have become much clearer. And the things that I thought were important are not as important anymore. So for me, the things that have become a lot more personal, a lot more important, and have become values and a compass for me in my life is this principle of loving God, loving your neighbor, and loving yourself. And that is such a core tenet to my faith. And so that has actually become a lot more pronounced and a lot stronger. And some of the peripheral things around that, the weight that those carry kind of is taken a back seat where my focus is on more loving and caring and understanding and truly walking with people, where that probably, even though I believe that my whole time in my faith and growing up, how I'm living that and the significance of that has evolved quite a bit. Where other things like, well, make sure that you read for 15 minutes in your Book of Mormon tonight. Like that for me doesn't have the same level of significance as, truly understand the meaning of the gospel in your life, and scriptures is a way to connect with that and learn from people that have come before you and to bring the Spirit in your life and cultivate that relationship with God. It feels a lot more internal to me than it did when I was younger, where it was a lot of things that I did. And now it's a lot of things that are really meaningful for me. And I hope I'm explaining this well. I don't typically articulate this journey that has been so inward. I think that's the best I can describe it.
No, I love that. And I think it's back to, I'm not sure the terminology you used earlier about that transformation of, it's not just a flip of a switch, but it's a process. And I know in our faith, it's called a conversion, as you're converting your heart and your values and your beliefs to align with what God has taught us. And to make a connection, earlier today, I'm going to quote you again. I was watching one of your videos, and mindfulness came up, and you brought up the concept that mindfulness isn't you can do formal mindfulness exercises, but mindfulness in your eyes is very much an attitude. And I think that's so applicable to religion as well. Is, yeah, there's gospel study, there's classes you can go to that help you develop habits that then make religion a lifestyle and an attitude, and ingrain in your being those things that will guide you in your values and how you treat other people and how you treat yourself. And that's that's where I think the power of religion comes in, and you see that, and it influences everything from sexuality to your career to what you do on the weekends. It's, I don't know how you could not talk about religion when all of this comes up, when
Yeah.
you put it like that.
Well, I like how you said that. For me, my faith very much is my anchor. And I think about my line of work, if I honestly reflect on what I do, it's X-rated. I hear some really rough things that are quite violent and horrific, things that people shouldn't go to or go through in their life, and things that I would not choose to watch as entertainment. And I think about that's my profession, and often what it feels like is I'm here on the shore and trying to find people in this ocean that are lost, and you have options, whereas you can sit on the shore and say, hey, you look really lost, like why don't you come back to shore, or you can choose to swim out and meet people there and kind of guide them back. But that ocean is really dark, and there's some rough, nasty things that people have gone through. And for me, I'm able to swim out there and spend a lot of time treading water with people and finding our way back. And for me, often how I get back, personally for me, is my religious faith. And those practices allow me to come back and take a shower from all the pollution that's in the ocean out there. But for me, it's my faith that compels me to keep going out and finding those that are struggling and lost. And people have said, you're on your own. It's my faith that propels me to do it, but it's also my faith that it gives me the ability to come back. And for me, initially, when I was going through graduate school, I kind of took this mentality of, I'm not going to worry about integrating my belief system right now. I'm here to learn psychology and learn how to become a psychologist and learn as many interventions and therapies and theories as I possibly can. And I'll worry about how to integrate my beliefs later. And I think that was actually a pretty helpful approach for me, where it's like these are so many different things. And the field of psychology has been around a lot longer than me. There's so much to learn. And I think about religion. I've spent a lifetime studying that. And now I've spent a good half of my life studying psychology. And for me, I spent time studying these independently, which I think has allowed me to now start to integrate these a little bit better within myself. But this takes a lot of time. And I still feel like I'm figuring this out as we're going. And my comfort around putting these together is still developing. So I'm hopeful looking back maybe 20 years from now, I'll be like, oh yeah, I'm a lot farther along than I was as I'm giving this podcast right now. And yet, this is where I am. And so I want to be transparent and open with where I am now and a bit of my journey. But I'd love to hear kind of your sense of kind of your faith, your background, so people can have an idea of where you're coming from in this conversation.
I will attempt to say it as eloquently as you have. I so like you, I've been a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and am so grateful for that in the way that it gave me a very, very good moral compass. And like you said, very good anchor. And it's cool to think of how many definitions anchor can have for someone. Because for you, you've seen that a lot in your career and being able to get back to shore and safety and feel like you're not stuck out there in the ocean. But for me, I find it as now a relief from my perfectionism,
Hmm.
as an acceptance approach to making mistakes and knowing that it's always there. And I think that's where the fundamental belief of Jesus Christ comes in, of having a savior. And when you're not perfect, when I'm not perfect, which has been too many a time, and for a long time I denied half of those times, I can, that's the anchor. And that's been very powerful for me. And it's been interesting to analyze my process within faith and religion of growing up, and I always thought that I um, believed very easily. Things felt right, and I took to them, and I tried my best to integrate them, and saw positive results. And as such, that led me to, it's like, love others. I loved others, and I was happy, and there it is, right? It can be that simple. But also, I think there were struggles bringing pornography into the mix of, now there's some dissonance of, um, I always had a very black and white view of religion. And I think to some extent, the language around commandments, for instance, is very black and white.
Oh yeah.
And so you don't get the wiggle room in the language. And that can lead to a lot of stressful problems for me, because it's perfect, right? And so if I'm not perfect within that, now all of a sudden volcano's back, right? And that stress leads to the intensity. And so it's been interesting. There have been times when I've doubted my faith, but I've never left it. Which I'm grateful for. And I know everyone is on a different boat out in the ocean or close to shore or wherever you are. And I think there's acceptance to that. You are where you are, and that's okay. But for me, there were times when I got very introspective and said, okay, why do I believe these things? Why do I believe that Christ can take my burdens and he suffered for my sins, yet sometimes I felt like he didn't help me at all with pornography. And so having that dichotomy of, I know this is true, but why isn't it working?
Yeah.
And how tough that can be. And I think that will be a pretty common occurrence among a lot of, and that's not monopolized by Christians. I think in any faith, it can be tough to have that dichotomy of really believing that something's true and then having some exception on the other end, and having to figure that out can be tough.
Yep. Maybe that's one thing I've come to accept. I was going to say tolerate. Maybe I'm working on acceptance, is this role of paradox. I find that paradox is at the center of mental health, and it's the center of religion, that there's always these dialectics or tensions between different things that don't seem compatible, and yet they're part of the same whole. It's like you said, your belief that, Christ has helped me with this, but why hasn't he helped me with that? It's like, yeah, that's part of the same whole, and yet it doesn't seem like it. It's like, this isn't working. Why isn't this working? And I think for me personally, what's been so heartbreaking, as somebody that has grown up in this faith that we share, and working with many people in counseling who share this faith, many of them struggled with their religious beliefs because of pornography, where it's like, because I have this struggle and I've tried all the things I was taught to do from church leaders and family, and they haven't worked, it must be that the things I were told or were taught is wrong. And I've seen a lot of people's faith begin to deteriorate and erode because of a struggle with pornography, because they've used kind of religious solutions for an emotional struggle, and those solutions didn't really address the issue. And sometimes it feels like, well, these are from God, or these are from my faith, they should fix everything, and if they don't, then none of it's true. And I've heard that story many, many times, and appreciated your view. It's like, wherever you are in the ocean, like drifting or castaway or close to shore, it's okay. Like, this very much is a journey. But I think that's honestly, maybe personally, what compels me to have these conversations around pornography and religion is it's painful for me to see people spiritually wounded because of a struggle with pornography. Because often those are so intertwined that they impact all parts of us.
And it's hard because they are intertwined, but to some degree they shouldn't be.
Mm.
And there's a very, maybe it's not as fine a line as my perfectionist self is thinking, but there certainly is a line where, okay, yes, sexuality and religion, like you said, have some kind of a symbiotic relationship of building off each other. They're both very deep core values that we have, but also realizing that most people's unwanted pornography viewing is an emotional concern, not related to how much God loves you or how much you love God.
Yeah.
And that was very hard for me. And
Yeah.
so I'm sure a lot of people have been, are, and will be in that same boat.
Yep. I think you're right. Those things feel independent. And it's those religious messages that turns that fire into the volcano. And I think that's the part I want to talk about. And I'm curious your thoughts. Like, what were specific religious messages or teachings or points of doctrine that were fire escalators for you that turned up the heat where it's like, oh my gosh, I believe this. And now this has turned into a volcano.
Fire escalators. I like that. It's a very profound term, very, very formal. I brought it up earlier. Commandments.
Commandments.
Very, very difficult to find wiggle room in there.
Yep.
And to find a loving, accepting approach of thou shalt not.
Yeah.
Hammer down.
Yep.
Right? Thou shalt not. And then the city gets destroyed for wickedness, right? And it's hard because I do believe in a very loving deity, who that is the last thing he would ever want to do. And so having to understand that, okay, there's these rules and they have some form of eternal consequence, and the language around them is very direct. It's very do not. Created a lot of stress.
Yeah, and I have so many thoughts there. I feel like I need to put a disclaimer. I am not a scriptorian. I am not a religious person. You should you should not come to me for your religious teachings. I guess I would say that. But I've thought a lot about those very things. And I think I approach my scripture study and faith as a psychologist and very much developmental. And I think about, as I'm reading the Bible, there's a very different feel in the Old Testament compared to the New Testament. And I think that's intentional. In that Old Testament, it's very much, here are the very specific, detailed commandments. Follow them or else. It's very straightforward. So much so that you can number them, 613 or 620 laws of Moses, very descriptive commandments. We can even boil down the 10 commandments, and it seems so simple on paper. And yet, when you think about even the 10 commandments, the most basic of commandments, my mind thinks of all the exceptions that I've seen, where it's like, thou shalt not kill. I'm like, yeah, I believe that. You shouldn't do that. And yet I think about, wow, there's a lot of killing and death that I'm kind of okay with. Like when it comes to protecting other people, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. Like, that's a really simple, basic commandment. Thou shalt not steal. Like, yep, I support that. And yet I think about, oh, there's actually times I've seen people take things that weren't theirs, but they needed to feed their kids. Like, I'm okay with that. Like, oh, shoot. Like, there's all these exceptions to these straightforward commandments. But I think about, that's the principle, and that's how children learn developmentally, is very concretely, here's a rule, here's a blessing. And I think that's kind of how the Old Testament is set up. Then the New Testament comes along, and it feels like God went through a transformation. And now God's like saying, okay, let's put those down. all of those laws hang on these principles of love God, love your fellow man, and love yourself. And we're like, no, 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 give us all the rules again. We'll follow those. He's like, no, like, really, we need to cultivate these attitudes and dispositions. And honestly, this is more difficult. There's no boxes you can check off. There's no rule to say, oh, I did that one. This is internal. It's hard to measure that stuff inside. So I think as humans, we struggle with that concept, even though it is part of that progression and where we're going. We're becoming more Christ-like from our faith. And yet our human mind's like, I'll go back to the rules. But the rules don't necessarily fit all of the situations. And I think there's a developmental progression from, let's teach you these very concrete principles to, now this is how we embody them in a very complex world. And so as I read the Bible, I see this developmental progression. There's a pretty dramatic shift from Old Testament to New Testament. And what I like about Scripture is it gives you some insight on how people that were receiving these teachings reacted. And they struggled. They struggle with the rules, and they struggle with the, let's focus on love. Like humans, by definition or by nature, we struggle. And I think that's part of it. And yet there's a development and a progression that I definitely see there, where it's okay to have commandments and values and morals and guides. And then there's something about, wow, but there's a lot of complexity. How do we navigate that too? And it sounds like for you, your faith has helped you navigate that complexity that doesn't always fit in these discrete, well, here's my top 10 commandments. And for me, often religion has a place there to help us navigate the parts where there's more ambiguity, where it's not as concrete.
I've got so many thoughts. Goodness. But how thankful I am for that. Because it is a higher law. And I think it adds so much depth to you as an individual, but also to religion and to all the other aspects of life that might influence into. Because I don't even know. I haven't thought any of these ideas out well enough to articulate, but that's a cool realization that there's a process and a transformation of going from that black and white to simplifying it to general principles that allow you to function in a more complex environment.
Yeah. And I like the word that you said earlier, this conversion. And it's scripture that pops to my mind is something Christ told his disciples. And he said, when thou art converted, go and strengthen your brethren. And I'm like, wait a minute. If these disciples and apostles weren't converted yet, like, oh, what chance do I have? But I think about that just speaks to this conversion is a process. It is a transformation. And you can have a lot of knowledge and understanding, and it's still a process. It's still a transformation. And for me, that gives me a lot of hope. But also, there's not like a lot of clear answers too, which I think is pretty uncomfortable. And so I think what we get set up with is these kind of paradoxes in Scripture. And I think about one of the verses that often trips people up is in the New Testament again, where Christ was teaching a higher law around adultery. Where he's like, in the old days, I said, don't commit adultery. That's bad. Don't do that. But I'm telling you that if you even lust after somebody else, that's committing adultery in your heart. And I found that a lot of people with perfectionism take that as more kind of fire accelerant. And it's like, wow, I've done that. Like, I've looked at so many sexual images. Think about the thousands of times I've committed adultery, which can often feel like one of the most serious sins somebody could commit.
Yeah, and just to go with that last part, to put a nuclear bomb in that volcano, it's now all of a sudden that is comparable to murder, right? And there's language around that, like sexual sin, is that serious to God. Um, and so now your simple act of pornography, which you associate with lusting, which you then associate with sin, which is then comparable to murder. Now you're a murderer or
Wow.
worse.
Is that what happens in your mind?
Yeah. And that seems so natural,
Whoa.
but that's the way it can work. And I think that's the power of that's the power of the language.
Yeah.
That's the power of religion and belief. And it all formulates this equation of, it can either be a volcano or you can understand it a little better and go through that process and realize that it doesn't have to end up in Pompeii, right?
Yeah.
You can have it be a little happier than that.
And you're right. There is so much power in belief and language. And adultery is one of those words that carries a lot of power to me. Um, because I think I've taken my marital commitment quite seriously. And the thought of cheating on my partner, her cheating on me, would be absolutely devastating. That is the farthest thing from my mind, and not even a worry I have for myself or my partner, because we are so committed to one another in our union. And adultery is one of those things. Like, I was watching a PBS show, and the lead character, I watched this show for a couple of seasons, and the lead character committed adultery, and I quit watching. I was done. And I knew this was just a show, but I'm like, I'm done. This is not entertainment. He hurt her so bad. I'm not even watching anymore. I was so done. And I was kind of like curious, like, wow, like you took that super personal. And I really did, where I'm like, no, you made a commitment. Like, don't do that. Because I think that kind of betrayal is really devastating, to have that level of commitment and then to go outside that and betray that is really quite devastating. But I think about some of those verses in the New Testament equated lusting after people, which we can make a pretty easy jump to say, well, noticing people, being attracted to them, looking pornography, that's the same thing. I've committed adultery. And I wonder if you've struggled with that thought of, wow, what if I am an adulterer? Like, what if I can't be safe or in a committed relationship? Like, I'm wondering what your mind does with that language and that power that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the wrestle is in very much in your head, because you have those thoughts. And for me specifically, there are a few points that I'll try to articulate, because you do have that black and white language of, if you, like, he who looketh upon a woman to lust after, and you think, oh, okay, zooming out, what else could pornography be? I mean, fundamentally on paper, it basically is that, right? It's very objectifying. And it seems like that's exactly the purpose, is to lust after someone. And as such, I think there's teachings, and I don't want to even pin this on anyone in particular, but maybe motivated a little bit more by fear.
Mm.
And they say pornography can lead to things like being disloyal, and betraying your loved ones, and it leads to a lot of hurt, and that adds more guilt and shame and intensity. And now there's a lot of paradox in there. And for me specifically, I never had a problem. I'm not married, but I treated every relationship I've been in, I would assume, as you would, in complete loyalty, and you're very devoted to that person. And there's no question about that. And it was hard to have that and then say, okay, wait, they were telling me that that shouldn't happen. Like I should be behaving a certain way because this behavior is still here. And I think, thank heavens, that didn't deter me from having relationships and getting to know and be with people. But I think it can be dangerous for some people in that they might be afraid of being in relationships, because they've heard that language and they don't know how they would act. It's and sorry, this is all kind of hard to say. I've never been down this
Yeah,
specific topic of conversation before.
that's what I was thinking as well, is we don't often think about religion and sexuality at this level. It almost seems like, oh, this is such a big deal and so important, I'm not going to investigate it. Like, I'll just take that verse at face level and just run away from it. And it's like, oh, let's actually understand that. Because if I think about how I've gotten to know you, you strike me as a very loyal, honest, committed person. You seem like a pretty safe person to be in a relationship with, I'm assuming. um, and often I hear that fear from people, or I'll hear people say, well, my partner looked at pornography and they did cheat on me. The pornography did that. And I don't think that's kind of how it works. I think it is the other direction, that pornography can be, I think people view pornography for lots of different reasons. And for some, it can be almost an excuse for behavior. And for me, yeah, there's different things. And I see the same thing if we compared it to like substances or drinking. Sometimes it's easier to think about drinking than it is about pornography because it's got so many loaded connotations. It's like we just can't think about it. It's volcano level.
Yep.
We can't look at it. And if you do think about a volcano, then what does that say about you? You must love porn. And it's like, no, we just need to understand this. But if I think about like alcohol, there's some people that can drink alcohol in moderation socially, and that's it. It's kind of relaxing, enjoyable. Other people consume alcohol as a way to cope with emotions and distress and conflict. And for me, I'd say that's probably less of a helpful way to consume alcohol, I would say. And then other people consume alcohol with this expectation that it's going to be a disinhibitor, that they're going to be more likely to be social or promiscuous or do things they typically wouldn't do if they weren't drinking. And I looked at this as a researcher, the impacts of alcohol intoxication on sexual risk taking. And it turns out people's kind of intentions or expectations behind drinking predicted behavior. So if you thought like, yeah, if I drink, I'm going to be more promiscuous, you were. If you thought, well, when I drink, I'm not, you weren't. And so I think we put so much emphasis on this substance led to this person cheating, or because they viewed pornography, that's why they cheated. And I would say that's not really what I've seen with substances or pornography, that there's people that are not faithful to their partners and cheat on them and also look at pornography. I've definitely seen that. But I've also met a lot of people who are quite faithful and loyal and look at pornography and will never cheat on that partner. And I think we put so much focus on these sexual images or the alcohol, we forget that there's a human making these decisions and they're drinking or viewing for really, really different reasons. And we give that substance or those images so much power that we forget to look at our partner and what kind of person they really are and the reason why they're viewing or drinking. And that to me as a psychologist is hugely relevant and a deciding factor. Like if you're dating somebody and they say, yeah, I've looked at pornography, that for me is like part of something they're doing, but it doesn't tell me much beyond that. Like that might be the best partner you're ever going to have, completely faithful and kind and gentle, or that might be a partner that's going to be abusive and mean and a jerk. The pornography is not the predicting factor there. It's just a piece of the puzzle, but getting to know that person and who they are takes time and vulnerability, and that's a process. And so I think as humans, we want to have a shortcut to say, well, if this behavior is present, they are safe or not safe. And it doesn't work like that. There's a lot of people I've known that don't look at pornography and have cheated on their partner. Like there's not something you can point to say, I'm good to go. I don't need to worry about this. This is going to be a safe relationship. I think it's too simplistic to say pornography caused this. There's way too much in our history and our psychology and with emotions and behavior to say this one thing caused all of these other events to occur. I just don't see it working that way.
I completely agree. I think it's completely irrational to assign something so overarching that it can encompass all the human complexity under it. And looking at those examples specifically, I just love what you said, that there's a human behind it. And it's been said over and over, like connection is the antidote to these struggles. And that's where you should put your focus. And for some reason, humans, I'm just going to say Old Testament humans, because it's very how it was, right? That there's a rule and something on the back end of that, a consequence or a blessing, right? And it's very, this equals this. And I think that's so linear and shallow, and it doesn't allow for human existence. But that when you start to incorporate love and acceptance, that's when you see deeper than that. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
And that's important for those struggling, but also for those who love people who are struggling.
Yep.
Or are in relationships with those struggling, or who may just know someone who's struggling, because your lack of judgment there will be a blessing, because maybe previous notions made you think, oh, they drink or they look at pornography and they're this kind of person. But looking at the human rather than this alcohol or pornography or whatever, that's so important. That's living a good life, right?
I love that. That's so well said. So if I jump back to that verse we were highlighting earlier, that if you looketh upon another to lust after them, you're committing adultery in your heart. I still believe that. Like if your intention is, I'm going to actually put my energy and efforts towards cheating on my partner, I say that's quite problematic and is betraying a relationship. And for me, it's like, yeah, I think that is a problem and needs to be addressed. And that's going to be devastating to cheat on your partner. So even trying to enact those steps is problematic for yourself and that relationship. But I think that is quite different than somebody saying, oh, I noticed an attractive person. It's like, well, that's natural and that's working. Because I've noticed a lot of attractive people, and I've been married for 15 years or so, and I've still noticed a lot of attractive people and can still honestly say, I never had that intention to commit adultery with any of those people. But I've noticed them. That's okay. That's normal. That's natural. But my heart does not have the intention on pursuing a romantic or physical or sexual relationship with those other people. Those are quite different. But I think we get so concerned about what this might mean, we don't take time to investigate it. And then those messages turn into volcanoes, where it actually makes it even harder. And then we feel even worse. Oh my goodness, look at all these times I've lusted in my heart. And I don't even know if those are the same things. We just haven't taken the time to dissect it.
I totally agree. And as a word of whatever advice I can give to anyone who might be in this struggle right now, in this mentality of, oh, have I committed adultery because I've noticed attractive people? I think that's where mindfulness comes in, because you're going to notice yourself noticing and say, okay, I'm human. Good. That's a plus. I have heart. I have eyes. Okay, nice. And then what you do with that is, oh, I noticed her and she walked away, and now I'm going to move on to something else. That's wonderful. But I honestly think that you can psych yourself out. She could walk away, but you could be thinking, oh my gosh, I just committed adultery. And now you're thinking about it even more. And in reality, it's just, okay, I noticed her. That is totally okay.
Yep.
And just let her walk by and you walk as well. And just a quick thing, because I remember going to meetings in the addiction recovery program and people saying things like, oh, I stopped looking at women below the shoulders. Like
Oh,
I won't even let my eyes wander. And I'm curious to hear what you think, but
yeah.
that that seems like a slippery slope. That's a dangerous game to play, because again, natural.
Yep.
Um, and heck, you could be looking down and she walks by and she's got shoes, and you're like, oh, I looked at her shoes, and like, oh no, like, right? It's just, it's asinine to think that you can be perfect in that regard.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I'm a little hypocritical saying all this, but working on it. But I'm curious to hear what you think, because that's dangerous language.
Yeah, and oh my goodness, you bring this up, and there's so many things I want to say, and I recognize we've probably been hitting an hour here,
Oh
but
gosh, okay.
I'll share my thoughts on that because I've heard that a lot from people. And I would say there's a big difference from noticing people you're attracted to quite naturally. And I think for me, myself, I identify as a heterosexual male. There's a difference between noticing an attractive female versus staring at her chest. Those are different things. That's quite objectifying. That would make me uncomfortable. That would probably make somebody else uncomfortable. I don't think that's really acceptable or okay. But
Right.
noticing another attractive female, it probably happens to me every week. It just happens. So I think there's a difference there. And I've actually, for kind of a homework assignment in counseling for people with that mentality, is I say, your homework for this week is to check people out. They're like, no. I'm like, yeah. I want you to notice people, like their whole body, but also notice their personality and also take stock in what you find attractive and what's appealing. Like you kind of want to be partnered with somebody eventually. It might be a good idea to figure out like what you're into and who you're interested in. So I want you to observe. And often that's a tricky homework assignment for people. And I would say particularly so, and we haven't even talked about this, but for people who are sexual minorities. So people that are not heterosexual, so people that are gay or bisexual or queer, where they've kind of been taught that not only is noticing somebody attractive bad, but I am attracted to the same gender, the same sex. I definitely can't check them out. And I give them the same homework assignment. Like this week, I want you to notice your buddy or your friend that's the same gender that you might be physically attracted to. And like, well, you can't do that. It's like, our mind can only do. So the more you try to not check somebody out, the more you are checking them out in a very non-productive, volcano creating way.
Well
Why
said.
don't you just notice them and understand it? And it's really different. Like just approach it instead of, I got to create all these barriers. And the barriers, like you said, just keep it in your mind and make it a bigger deal. And so if I think about how I apply this to myself, this is going to be weird because these are my internal thoughts, but this is what my mind does. So I read a lot of sports articles. I just like that's what I do for fun. I read about NBA stats and trades and profiles and the Players Tribune. I just love reading all those articles. And I'd say by the time I scroll to the bottom of the article, there's typically a couple of links you can click on, and it's got an image of an attractive female. It's just there. They know that probably a lot of men are reading these articles, and here's some attractive female. And every time I finish an article, my eyes directly see those images. Like they gravitate towards those. Even though I'm like, oh, I love that story about LeBron, one of my favorite basketball players. And I'm like, oh, attractive female. And I'll look at that. And then in my mind, it's almost automatic now. It's like, yeah, your eyes are looking at her because she is attractive. This image is selectively placed there because they know you will find it attractive. This is programmed. This is how it works. Acknowledge she's attractive, and now get back to work. You already read your article. Your purpose is done. And that's about it. And my mind kind of goes through that, where it acknowledges you clearly saw this image. You clearly found it attractive. That's all normal. And you have a choice here. You can now click on that image and potentially introduce some viruses to your computer, or spend some time looking at other images that you will also find attractive because you're programmed to find them attractive. Or you could spend your time doing things you actually care about. And that's what my decision process is. It's like, yeah, you could look at more images you find attractive. You could do that. But really, you find a lot more enjoyment reading about sports. And I do. And then it's like, now take this time to go play with your kids, or do some work, learn a better way to address trauma with the clients you're working with. But just acknowledging that is a mindful moment, and now unlocks all of these avenues where it takes a potential volcano into a little fire where, yeah, you could stare at this image for a few more seconds if you want, 30 seconds if you want. There's not a lot of harm in that, but how much time do you want to spend looking at an image? It's just, honestly, in my mind, it's just not very productive. And there's a lot of other things I want to do with my time and my energy than looking at more images that I do find attractive. And yeah, my mind actually has those thoughts. And I just walk myself through that. And then it's like, move on to the next thing. But I think if I'm like, oh, why did you look at that? What does that say about you? How could you? Are you committing adultery in your heart? I would probably at some point in the day come back and click on that image. I'm guessing. But I typically don't have that reaction. It's a lot more understanding and mindful. And then I forget about that image until the next time I read the sports article, and then it's back. It's like, oh yeah, that image is there. Of course it's there. And of course you're interested. Moving on. For me, that's the beauty of mindfulness, is it really unlocks your ability to choose. But it does require you being aware and having some kind of commentary internally about, yeah, it's okay. You notice this attractive image. Yep. Now what do you want to do about it?
I'm really excited because I have a lot of questions about that, because you get into a lot of the solutions normal people would assume help, like filters that restrict that agency, right? Your ability to choose. And I think the healthiest approach is to always, I'm an agent of agency.
Yeah.
I absolutely believe in giving people the ability to choose. And that's going to be the healthiest approach. And so maybe next episode I can go into all those questions, because you get into all of that when you go into the recovery programs, or when you're looking up ways to stop individually. And I think this is the best approach. Yeah. So I'd be excited to hear what you have to say.
Whew. And I feel like we scratched the surface on things we could potentially talk about religion. And then you bring up filters, I got a lot to say there.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think coming back to where we started today about this process and this urgency to have it figured out and do the right thing and say the right thing in these conversations, I think that's honestly what I really enjoy about my work as a psychologist, is I get to meet with people over an extended period of time and get to keep having conversations. And so I'll have a chat with somebody, and then throughout the week I'll think about, we should have covered this, or I didn't ask about that. And it's like, next week I have an opportunity to continue that conversation. And if this really wasn't meaningful or important, I'll remember. It'll come up. If it wasn't, it'll go away and we'll go somewhere else. And I take that approach to counseling, that it wasn't like, that was my shot to like help somebody with depression. It's like, no, I'll see him next week. We're going to keep this conversation. We're going to keep learning. And there's times that I'm helpful and times I'm not helpful as a psychologist. And I feel like I can even recover from that, that I can learn about what this person might need and what might be helpful, that there's always another conversation that I get to have with somebody, which is really comforting for me, that therapy is a process too. And even helping somebody is a process. So even in these podcasts, like there's a lot of things we could have said and probably could have said better, but you know what? We got next week. We're going to keep this chat going.
Absolutely. The best part.
Yep. I'm looking forward to it. These are so fun. And we sketch out things we want to cover, and then we cover even more. So we don't have a deadline on these. We're just going to keep this conversation going, keep chatting about these concepts. And I hope this is as meaningful as you all as it is for myself and Brian.
Me too.
Okay. Till next week.
All right. See ya.
Yep. Hey, thanks for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe. I know you might be facing some issues in your life or know someone who is. Issues like anxiety, challenges in dealing with emotions, or other compulsive behaviors like unwanted pornography. And I know it's tough to talk to people about problems. Difficult to stare those obstacles down that we face in life and to really know how to deal with them. It's hard to know what to say and when to say it. And then when that moment you finally reach out to family and friends happens, sometimes it falls flat. I haven't found many programs teaching effective strategies like mindfulness, how to improve relationships, and ways to address unwanted pornography viewing through research-supported principles. So whether you simply want to help with a problem like unwanted pornography, difficulty responding to emotions, or just want to understand the world of someone struggling with porn a little better, head over to LifeAfterPornography.com and get in on the next training. There you'll learn the exact same strategies individuals addicted to pornography used to transform their lives by implementing principles from evidence-based treatment shown effective in research for reducing unwanted pornography viewing. You'll learn the secrets, the myths, the enemies to recovery, and the LAP framework for dealing with unwanted porn viewing that we call WAVE. If that's something that interests you, click the link in the description or just head over to lifeafterpornography.com. I'm Dr. Cameron Staley. See you on the inside.